Okay, folks, I think I'm going to dive in. I think we got a few folks joining us. So once again, we appreciate you taking some time to have this very important conversation about U.S.-China relations and specifically about U.S.-China dialogue and some research that we've been doing over the last 9 months or so. My name is Dan Jasper. I'm the Asia Advocacy Coordinator, and again, I'm based here in Washington, D.C. So I'm here to talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing and some really important points, I think, on the U.S.-China relationship, which is becoming more and more crucial. I probably don't need to tell anybody who's dialing in that that U.S.-China relations are at a very tense moment right now in history. Most dialogue and engagement has really come to an end, and it really came to an end in about 2017 during the Trump administration, and it hasn't really gotten off the ground under the Biden administration. Washington right now, there's a sort of prevailing narrative that engagement and dialogue didn't work. And this is really problematic in a lot of ways because it's become sort of cemented, I think, in the mentality in Washington that we're in a place now where diplomacy is no longer valuable. And that's the thinking anyways. And we really wanted to challenge that idea. And so actually we set about to research what has become of U.S.-China dialogue and really what were the lessons that we could learn, and if we could actually monitor and evaluate U.S.-China dialogue processes in like a similar way that we do for policy interventions or like international development interventions to see, were there quantifiable, tangible outcomes that came out of these processes that really improved the relationship, that improved, U.S. national security and global security more largely. And we did that because, the conversation in Washington moved very quickly. There was a point where, again, probably about 2017, where people just decided that U.S. and China dialogue didn't work. And there wasn't really a whole lot of evidence being put forward. It was just sort of this broad sweeping statements. And so, AFSC came together with another organization called the National Committee on American Foreign Policy to do some research, to really look at this in a sort of, research-driven method to see if we could actually find if there was proof that engagement and dialogue worked or proof that it didn't work. So before I go into that research, I want to make a couple notes on vocabulary. People use the term dialogue quite often in international relations, and they use it in confusing ways because there's sort of the general way that people use it and meaning just like talking to one another, right? And diplomacy sort of writ large. But there's a specific way that it's used also, and that really is relating to official dialogue processes. And this is really important to know because there are official processes that exist, especially for the U.S. and China in the past, where it starts at the working level. So mid-level bureaucrats start talking about their issue. So I don't know, just for example, like wildlife trafficking management. So, those in charge of that issue will get together at the working level and they'll push conversations up to their superiors, and it'll sort of go up the food chain until it finally gets to the principal level. The principal level could be secretaries, it could be the presidents, it could be anybody sort of just at that level of, of authority that can really make decisions on these issues. So these processes are very specific in nature. There's a lot of protocol that goes into it. There's a lot of resources and thought that goes into it. Oftentimes they are very short in nature. So a dialogue actually can take place over the course of like 2 days where, hundreds of people from each side get together. And you really they'll speak about a whole array of issues, and these principals, these really high level people only get just a few minutes to speak. They get maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and that's about it. Most of the conversation is done at the working level, and that's kind of where things get moved through. But I just want to make that distinction because I think it's important, and it has a bearing on the research that we did as well, and just sort of understanding what we looked at. So again, just going back to the research, we linked up with, again, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and I want to give them a shout out. They were wonderful partners in this, and they really sort of brought this vision to life. And we also worked with 4 independent researchers to try to do an honest assessment of dialogue. So how do we do that? We basically zoomed in on on the process called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue process, which existed under Obama. And it took place from, we looked at the years from 2010 to 2016. That was a process. It was an official dialogue process. And it was by and large an umbrella process that sort of encompassed all these discussions, working level venues, and even like local level engagements, city to city, state to state level engagements. It sort of just encompassed all of that and would feed up all these priorities to the principal levels. It would sort of comb through all these issues throughout the year, and then it would sort of it would culminate in a joint statement between the US and China, and they would lay out what they committed to on each issue. And so that gave us some really great data, because at the end of each dialogue, again, they would lay out these issues, and it resulted from 2010 to 2016, it resulted in about 1,000 commitments. And so from a researcher standpoint, that's like our heaven, right? There's a ton of data that we can look at. We can see what each country committed to, and then we could follow those commitments and track them, what became of them. So we track them largely through publicly available data, as well as doing interviews with past participants and officials to get their take on it. So we really did try to put our researcher hat on here and try to measure these things in objective ways. And so there's a lot of nuance in terms of the methodology that we went through. It's really interesting because like these dialogue processes, like lawyers had to weigh in order to sort of figure out the best phraseology for a lot of these commitments. It had to be above the aspirational level, but below like an international agreement. So a lot of times we would come up against like phrases like strengthening, they committed to strengthening cooperation on X, or we're encouraging the participation of the private sector. These things sound good, but it's really hard to measure what counts as strengthening cooperation or encouraging private sector cooperation, that kind of stuff. We went through a lot of publicly available data, and I think we did our best at sort of sorting out what was measurable, what we really could find evidence of increased participation or whatever of, and what we couldn't measure. And then there was also what we could verify and what we couldn't verify. So some things were potentially measurable, but we couldn't verify because we didn't have access to the data. Some things that come to mind were like, China changing its official software programs to be all legitimate software programs. That's something we don't have access to in terms of, internal bureaucracy management in China. There are also classified processes in the US that made commitments that we just wouldn't have had access to. So we did our best to really just sort of sort out what we could look at and what we could measure. And I think what we found was extremely encouraging. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I could go into, but I'll just try to keep it sort of high level for this conversation. The top lines really are that dialogue worked. One, prior to 2017, it helped us manage pandemics. It helped us improve climate mitigation strategies. It actually was one of the instrumental reasons that got China into the Paris Agreement. And it also helped stabilize the world economy after the 2008 financial crisis. So there were, these are just sort of the top ones that stick out to me, but there was a lot of sort of nitty gritty that that the dialogue process advanced as well. After doing the research, I did some sort of back of the envelope math on this. And I calculated that China made good on about 75% of its commitments. That is pretty extraordinary. And I think I heard anecdotally from a couple of the interviewees that said that China made probably good on about 80% of the commitments. That's far above what I think the normal narrative in Washington is right now. There's a lot of criticism that China sort of strung the US along. It would sort of put these things down on paper and then never really follow through. That was not the case that we found. In fact, in a lot of cases, we found that even after the dialogue processes stopped, China still carried forward on some of these commitments. The one thing that comes to my mind is I think early in the Obama years, China committed to speeding up reform of its monopoly law. They had a 2008 anti-monopoly law that the U.S. really wanted to see some more progress on. And throughout the S&ED from 2000 2010 to 2016, we saw incremental progress in that. And interestingly enough, it culminated in China creating a new enforcement agency that had more power and more authority in 2019. So 3 years after this official dialogue process stopped, China still continued on with a lot of these reforms. Of course, there were some issues in terms of, it didn't solve all of U.S.-China problems, but it was a really important catalyst for moving things forward. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that it helped bridge systemic differences. This, I think, is really important, and I think the nuance is sort of lost sometimes on the American public. The China system is very different from the U.S. system. That's very obvious, but I think it's not appreciated in terms of the nitty-gritty of diplomacy. On the China side, you have a very top-down system. And so mid-level bureaucrats won't really typically act until they get a directive from their superiors. In the US, we tend to have a bottom-up approach where it's up to the mid-level bureaucrats to sort of come up with ideas and generate policy solutions and push that up for their superiors to then have input on and sort of continue that process up the food chain. So how do you, one's going down and one's going up, and how do you actually make these two systems meet is really important, right? Because if you have a meeting at the mid-level bureaucratic level, the U.S. side says there's not a lot of progress being made. Why isn't that? And it's because the top, there hasn't been that directive from the superior level. So you have to get up to that level. And I'm sort of imagining, just to grossly oversimplify things, I'm imagining a loop here. So you have the U.S. needs to move it up their food chain in order to get it to the principal level at the China side, and then the China side can move it down their food chain, and the next round of talks can be more substantive. And that's something that's really important because there's a rhythm of diplomacy that's necessary to bridge our two systemic differences. So that I think is really important and one of our key takeaways. Another one that was really key was that these conversations basically gave windows into each other's systems. I think that on both sides of the ocean, basically, that there's a confidence that the U.S. understands the Chinese system and how it works and vice versa. But in reality, there's a lot of nuance that is very difficult to understand from the outside. And so to have these conversations to say, the president, for example, on the U.S. side, the president doesn't have the authority to do X. That's a congressional side. That's so important to explain to the China side. Otherwise, there's a misunderstanding there about, and I think a frustration from the other side that reads inaction as a sort of insult and a dismissal of interest, when in fact it may just be a systemic issue, and the things that really need to change and move aren't really the interlocutors that they have in place. So if they're interlocuting with the executive branch, they may actually need to have conversations with Congress to make things move. I hope that makes sense. But basically what I'm getting at is that there were all sorts of nuance that interviewees wouldn't have been able to get just by doing desk research. They have to have an interface with folks who can explain their systems. And this happened with US officials trying to understand the Chinese system as well. Another thing that really was interesting, I think, was that, what we heard from interviewees was the fact that when this first started, the China side was a little bit shy in terms of making asks. Their interests tended to be a little bit more regional in nature, and they tended not to put forward asks in terms of like regulatory changes in the US. Whereas the US came with a sort of full-blown agenda. They had so many things that it was a little bit overwhelming. Our interests are global in nature. And so there was a sort of mismatch in terms of interest there, that over time, the dialogue process started to even things out. And China became more comfortable with the process and understood that it could make asks of the US side. I think that there was some discussion over whether or not China was really utilizing that process well, but I think that's sort of a matter for another discussion entirely, because really it allowed them to get to a more even place at that table. And even one interviewee mentioned that President Xi Jinping actually made a comment at the closing ceremony of one of the SNEDs that that the dialogue process is useful, but that we needed to have less lecturing from the US and more reciprocal discussions. So I think that's indicative of how the mindset moved over time and really put people and I would say, interlocutors and counterparts more on an even scale, which again helped advance interests in a lot of different ways, because again, one thing that I think is lost is that it developed personal relationships between people. And we heard on numerous occasions that those personal relationships were absolutely instrumental in moving specific issues, because, there may have been, a misunderstanding of where an issue would move within the Chinese system. And they would continuously sort of ping somebody at the wrong minister, say at the wrong ministry, and they would get nowhere. And then they would sort of speak to one of their friends, essentially one of their counterparts that they had developed a good relationship with, and say, look, we're not getting anywhere with this issue. What would you advise? And they would say, look, you're talking to the wrong person. You need to talk to Y over at Ministry X. And that type of stuff is totally invaluable. And I think it's a little bit less tangible than some of the things that we found, but it is nonetheless incredibly important, right? And I'll also mention, just that you're probably getting a flavor for, that this type of process is totally instrumental in moving progress, especially when it comes to China, which is a very sort of protocol-intensive system. They like to have those ceremonies. They like to have those face-to-face meetings at the leader levels. And I think that it's important because it gives them face. And I think that it's an important aspect of the Chinese culture that, again, is not always totally appreciated on the U.S. side. So this process is absolutely critical. And actually, we heard just during the UN General Assembly from the UN Secretary General that he was suggesting that U.S. and China get back to these levels of dialogue. And I think that that's because he recognized that this process really is key. Just a couple more key takeaways here. It was an action forcing mechanism, these dialogues, because they happened basically at the same time. It happened in the summer every year, and it allowed bureaucrats to have that deadline to push things, right? And then they would come together and they would commit to something that would usually be within a year as well. So they could commit to something, and then they would have that the next year, they would have another deadline to meet. And so it was important to keep issues moving forward. It also interfaced with other dialogue processes. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the beginning, but I meant to, that U.S.-China dialogue goes back to the 1970s, and every president pretty much had their own sort of iteration of it, with a few exceptions, such as one dialogue process is called the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, or the JCCT, and that one's been running, I think, since the 80s. And that's been a really important mechanism to move economic interests forward, and that took place in the winter. And so the SNED took place in the summer. They could commit to something to say, by the time the JCCT meets, we want to do X, and then they would, and they would have another action forcing mechanism, another deadline, which is absolutely critical in moving bureaucracies, right? So we found that it was an important mechanism within the rhythm of diplomacy that, again, is just no longer there. I want to quickly just have a note on this is a sort of personal take on things about what it means to advance U.S. interests. After the release of this report, we are getting a little bit of criticisms, which we totally expected, and I think we wouldn't be doing our job if we weren't getting criticisms. So that, I think, is actually a good sign. But one thing that we're hearing is that, believe it or not, people are actually making the argument that the dialogue didn't move U.S. interests, core interests, and that things like pandemic management, things like climate change mitigation, and things like macroeconomic stabilization were not U.S. core interests. And people are actually making the argument that we shouldn't sacrifice core interests for things like climate change mitigation. And so when you hear that, it's really confusing, obviously, because certainly climate change mitigation is within U.S. interests. And I think it's important to sort of take a step back and think to ourselves, okay, so what is it that's being sold to us as a core U.S. interest? What do they really mean by this? And this is my personal take, and in no way reflects my fellow researchers, but it really does seem to reflect the fact that corporate interests are synonymous with U.S. core interests, and that are being elevated above the interests of the U.S. public in a lot of ways. If people are saying that climate change mitigation is not a core U.S. interest, then I think that's a huge red flag, right? And so, unfortunately, we have this sort of narrative that has developed in the sort of China watcher community in Washington that suggests that dialogue was not effective at moving things like intellectual property rights. Now, intellectual property rights, one of the things that we found was actually it made a lot of progress under the dialogue. It's probably not to where some corporations would like to see it, but it did actually make a lot of progress. But to me, if we had to weigh intellectual property rights versus climate change mitigation, the answer is very clear, that we need to emphasize climate change mitigation. So I worry that we are now in a state in which corporate interests have subsumed, have sort of swallowed U.S. public interest in a lot of ways, and now that is the focus. And it's been sort of almost like a sinister takeover of what it is, what we mean by U.S. interests, right? And to me, this reminds me of some of the history of U.S.-China relationship, specifically the Opium Wars. And just to sort of quick history here, the Opium Wars were really over the fact that China tried to stop Western countries from selling opium inside the country because it was decimating lives. And Britain and France really thought differently and actually fought a war to try to open up these markets. And so here we're at a point again where Washington has declared that engagement has failed because it hasn't produced enough market access for certain corporations. Climate change mitigation, pandemic management, that stuff is superfluous. It's corporate interests that need to advance. I think that is incredibly dangerous, and I think that it's something that we need to sort of point out more and more. And I would say that just having conversations about what it is that we're finding here, that actually U.S.-China dialogue did improve what we could call public interests, is really important to spread that narrative and to sort of counter this really insidious discussion about what it is to mean U.S. core interests. Just as a side note, too, the only Westerners who were allowed inside China during the Opium Wars were the Quakers, because they had a trusted relationship on both sides. And I think that there's unfortunate. It seems like some history is repeating itself here. And another note on that is that the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations helped us launch this report. They held an event for us. And for those who don't know, AFSC actually helped establish the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in the 60s after it wrote a report called A New China Policy. And it was sort of, AFSC circled the wagons with a couple other NGOs and created the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And now we're here in another point where it feels like we're sort of, again, circling the wagons and trying to put forth a new narrative in the U.S.-China relationship. A lot is coming full circle, and it really does worry me because the U.S.-China relationship is absolutely critical to get right, especially in the face of a pandemic and climate change crisis. We just cannot afford to have a new Cold War. And I really do fear that there are entities in Washington that are trying to sell us a new Cold War with China. And so it's really critical that we're out there putting forth the idea that no, actually dialogue did work, and we have proof, we have data to back that up. So I know I'm sort of running a little short on time. I'll just quickly end with this note that, the recommendations that we put forth, we kind of got into the weeds about how to run dialogues and things like that. But the main recommendations are probably no surprise if you've been listening, is to restart the dialogue process, perhaps on a limited scale. But we need to have that process in order to move progress. We just cannot expect, this era of monologue to get us very far, right? We really did move from an era of dialogue to an era of monologue. And what do we expect for these sort of rhetorical shots at one another to advance? It's not going to improve anything, certainly. And the last one is that I'll mention really quick is that we need to manage expectations. And I think that there was a lot of expectations around what dialogue would improve. And I think that there were inflated sort of expectations that China would become a full-fledged capitalist democracy like the US. And that was never the intention of dialogue. And it was never the intention of either side to manage the entire relationship through these dialogue processes alone. It was just one tool that we had, and it happened to be a very effective tool. So we're saying that, we need to manage expectations to not allow people to have this narrative that dialogue is going to change the internal circumstances of China to reflect what some in Washington would like it to look like. So those are the main two recommendations. And I'll just stop here and sort of let everyone digest what I said and see if there's any questions here in the comments. I do see one from Kevin Piper. Why do you feel we have got to the point of announcing a US, UK, and Australia defense alliance? That's an interesting question. I think that there's probably an answer that goes far beyond China, but certainly that's an aspect of it. I think that there is an attempt by the Biden administration to rebuild alliance structures, and there may be some thinking about how to almost leverage the fact that Trump destroyed these alliance structures into a new worldview and what that might look like. Given that the UK is now, sort of floating further and further away from the EU, there probably is some interest in making sure that US-UK relationship stays tight, probably on both sides of the ocean. And Australia, of course, has had a lot of tensions with China in the recent years. And so there's always been a sort of push for strengthening that military cooperation. And I would actually say that the one to look into is the Quad, which is the US, India, Australia, and Japan. And that is being sold as sort of the NATO of the Pacific. I don't think it's been too formalized just yet, but it's certainly on its way to being formalized in a lot of respects. And that to me is another block that presents, I think, or could be viewed by China as a tightening noose. And that does worry me a little bit that we're establishing, a really tight military structure around China, and it may strike some fear into them. So the question is why. We could probably get into even more deeper discussions about the need to sell military equipment and things like that. But I think that that's probably a conversation beyond this presentation. But good question. Okay, I'm just scanning for other questions here. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so maybe we can wrap things up here. I really appreciate everybody who joined in today. We're going to continue to talk about this research probably for months to come here. We really appreciate everybody sort of taking the time to learn about this stuff. It's really incredibly important to learn. The more you can share it with people who you know that might be interested is super helpful. And the more that you can speak to policymakers and to people who are in positions of influence, that's really, really incredibly important right now to try to take the temperature down in the room between the US and China right now, and to offer the counter narrative that the dialogue actually did work. And we just have sort of skated past that in a lot of ways. And so, feel free to read I'll actually mention that the data set is a living data set and we'll continuously update it. There's instructions. If you have input for us, please feel free to send that input to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Other than that, please keep in touch, and we really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks so much, everyone.